Well, I'm doing my speech from when Vietnam War and what life was like. My Uncle Gary, well, my great Uncle Gary was involved in it about 35 years ago, 40 years ago. So, but according to USHistory.org, the war started in 1965, and when Johnson and Kennedy declared that he would go. Here's a picture of Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the communist country, which was Vietnam was once a whole country, and then they divided north and south, and he was the head of the north. And in South Vietnam, which is also known as Viet Cong, they tried to fight against the communists, Ho Chi Minh, and the whole north. We all know what communism is, but as like a definition of it is just like where all individual freedoms and ownerships get taken away, and it's controlled just like Hitler did with the Holocaust. And also there is the flag of South Vietnam, which was used during the war and stuff. Why the U.S. people didn't like it, and why were they disagreeing with the war? U.S. people, when we found out we entered the war, the people, and the draft was in effect, there was an uproar. The U.S. didn't want to have to deal with another type of Holocaust because they're fighting against communism, and we all know what Hitler did to the Jewish people. The people didn't understand, according to my Graham, who I interviewed, she said the people didn't understand why, and that's what made such an uproar. They didn't understand why we were going in a country that didn't want us there. How was the war broadcasted? According to my Graham, there was 3 major networks at the time. The 3 major networks were ABC, CBS, and NBC, and the radio also broadcasted it in the newspapers. And my Graham said stories. She told me, she said when she watched TV, there'd be some of the major networks would show graphic events and show death tolls. So when her brother was over in the war, she and her family, which was 11 other brothers and sisters, waiting to hear from their brother, that they wouldn't listen. It was more a try to stay away from it and just try to think positively about it. And due to the graphic things that the stations were showing, some people wouldn't watch news because they didn't want to see the horrific events. That's an example of like what a newspaper will look like during the time. What was life back home? Graham stated that there was lots of panic, there's protesting, and there's a lot of conflict. And I asked her about like how the economy was doing due to the war, and she said the economy was struggling because the country and the government was pouring all their money into the war. And anyone with a family member serving would have to wait for letters from their loved ones for about 2 to 3 weeks. She said there was times where she didn't hear from her brother for a couple months. And in the letters that my Uncle Gary would send her back would be, there's nothing was spoke about the war. He didn't say where he was. He wanted to keep everything soft and light, so that way the family wouldn't worry. If the family didn't hear back, they would obviously worry, but there was another way that my Uncle Gary could communicate with the family, and that was through the Red Cross. The Red Cross would get his information, and they would send it to the United States barracks, and the barracks would then send it back to the family, and an officer would show up to their door, and well, hopefully there wasn't a death to tell him that he died, but the officer would show up to the door and tell him that everything was okay and that he was still alive. When my great uncle left for the war, my grandma said he was a fun, happy, young teenager. And when he came home, due to the Agent Orange and the PTSD, he came back solemn and half the man he was when he left because he didn't know who he was because of what he'd seen. And what Agent Orange was the chemicals, due to like Vietnam being really grassy and grainy, the chemicals from the United States sent over chemicals that would be dropped on top of the soldiers and would kill the plants and stuff, and it led to some diseases. And from that, my Uncle Gary then got PTSD, which post-traumatic stress disorder, and he still deals with depression to this day. He just recently started talking about it about 5-10 years ago, she said, and he is still depressed. During Christmas time or any holidays, he stays to himself and he doesn't talk to anybody, and the only people he talks to are his brothers, who he says he fought in war with. And the one thing I wanted to conclude on was this comic. It says, the first thing that happened when I got off the plane in San Francisco, a girl in love beads and a headband spat on my face and called me baby killer. The soldiers weren't taken seriously, and they looked at his back for going over to the other country. Thank you.